And we've got lunatics running around at the same scale or greater, and of course greater because today's weapons are greater. Samantha Power, her loopiness, the mentally unstable passionaria of humanitarian bombing, the woman who has weaponized human rights as an aggressive weapon in the arsenal of imperialism. Sam Power says this morning, this Friday, the 18th of July, that there's no doubt it's the Ukrainian separatists, those evil characters. They're the ones who shot down the Malaysian airliner. With this, she joins in probably the 8th or 9th circles of hell the perpetrators of July and August of 1914. We'll talk about them. Count Berchtold might be a good guy for today, since we're talking about investigations. This would be, if you send out Samantha Power to speak for your government, this would be in 1914. This would be like sending out Rasputin to speak for the imperial Russian government, which he ran behind the scenes. You could have Madame Blavatsky speak for the French government. Aleister Crowley speak for the British government, right? In other words, notorious kooks, loony birds, crackpots. But there's the way it is. Samantha Power should not be over there at, Turtle Bay, Kips Bay, whatever it is, on the East River. Sam should be in Creedmoor or Bellevue. That should be her winter home in Bellevue and her summer palace out on the island at Creedmoor. So the lunatics have taken over. I urge people, get a hold of yourself. This is the time for clear thinking and, above all, timely, effective, relentless, energetic action to stop monstrosities that are now clearly outlined in the mist ahead of us. If you want to motivate yourself, get that movie The Day After. Get that The Day After, ABC 1984, Jason Robards. In The Day After, you will be amazed at how many geographical similarities and propinquities we have to the current crisis, because the whole thing starts with a crisis around Berlin, the Autobahn, the German border, DDR, and the rest of it. Couple of 100 Ks, 500 Ks, whatever it is, to the southeast, you're going to get into the heart of where we are now. And this is not good. Now, I urge you to look at the Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. When there's a crisis, you should always turn to the Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. And this has all the detailed information. I'm not sure I can repeat every piece of information about this, but it's all documented. It is reasonably comprehensive there on Twitter. So if you haven't subscribed to that, man, you should subscribe now. Now the immediate question: what's the motive? Why have this, and why now? Well, clearly, NATO intelligence, U.S. CIA, UK MI6, French DGSE, Italians, Spanish, whatever, most likely involved. This is principally the response to the creation of the BRICS Bank. The casus belli here is the BRICS Bank, the Fortaleza Summit. Don't ever forget this connection. All the details on Ukraine, we'll get to some. We'll get to the critical ones, and the rest of them are on Twitter. Those are important to be able to knock down reactionary, warmonger, neocon, humanitarian bomber arguments, but principally the BRICS Bank. It is the first systematic challenge to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank since their creation in 1944. Now, those institutions were always rotten. If Roosevelt had lived longer and not been assassinated by the Sir William Stevenson, man called Intrepid, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Roald Dahl spy ring, if Roosevelt had survived, the IMF, I think, would have been a lot better. But under Truman, meaning under Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, Clark Clifford, Skull and Bones. Under Truman, it's obvious that the Bretton Woods institutions were already perverted. Even so, they worked well for a good 25 years, better than any world system before or since. But the first challenge to the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, the dollar, and to the system of privately controlled central banks, either privately owned, which is debatable in some cases, but in any case, privately controlled. Central banks that serve bankers, a bank for banks. That's not what we need. We need a national bank. In other words, a bank for the nation, for all relevant economic interests, be it labor or manufacturing or the farmer or universities or scientific research or healthcare. All of that has to be brought in as a national bank. So that is what we get from Fortaleza. We've been waiting for this for quite a while. This has been long in the works. It is unfortunately not as big as it might have been, but under these conditions, we're going to take it. So the Fortaleza Brazil Conference of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa is a turning point in modern world history. And, of course, this is the kind of thing that sends the City of London and the Wall Street finance oligarchs into hysterics, into flights forward. That is what we are seeing. It was a time clock, right? You could set up a stopwatch. Once the BRICS Bank had been announced, it was likely that something like this would happen in the short term. And here it is, less than 1 year after Ghouta Syria chemical weapons hoax, yet again an attempt for a general war. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C., 18th of July 2014. On the brink. Is it July 1914? It may be. What are you going to do about it? Time to mobilize. We have candidacies. We have all kinds of things. You can join. Governor of New York, Senator from Nebraska. We'll have other things that you can take part in. Get on Twitter. Fight the good fight. Go into the blood and sand of the arena and fight those warmongers and merchants of disinformation. Go and you can give your candid opinion about Samantha Power. She is, by the way, in the U.S. defense establishment, proverbial as a loopy, insane person. You can read this, Michael Hastings, The Commanders, right? The guy got killed. One of the things he catalogs is that all kinds of generals think that Samantha Power is nuts, and they don't want to be controlled by her. That also came to the fore in the Syria crisis. Now, 1 year ago, you were almost burned, right? You were almost burned, and you were almost burned by those tapes. Later, when we had time, we had Mother Agnès Mariam Delacroix, and we tried to sponsor her trip here as much as we could. We tried to help her along when she made her U.S.-Canada tour last November, December. And then we had Seymour Hersh come online, right, with two articles, one at the beginning of this year and then one in the springtime. It's all a fraud. The whole Ghouta chemical weapons, this was a fraud. Now, you got to learn something here. It's time to take off the blinders, take off the goggles. And in particular, they tried to start a general war last August, September, and now we've got another attempt at a general war. You can see it coming. So you mobilize now. Don't wait for me to be proved right. The point of this stuff is not to prove how smart I am. I already have proved that. The point is to stop these events from happening. That's the interesting proposition. And, of course, in the course of that, many times your predictions, if that's what they are automatically proved wrong. Good. Bring it on. That's the goal. So here's what it is now. The goal of this is obviously to gin up a new phase against Ukraine. Why now? Well, really two reasons. One we've just mentioned in outline, the BRICS Bank. $50 billion now available for infrastructure and hard commodity development. By the way, not sustainable development. Not sustainable at all in the way they mean it. that woman, that heroin addict on one of the international cable TV shows, right? The one with the dark circles, Punk Rock News or whatever she is. That stuff that she talked about is complete baloney. She has no idea. This is going to be infrastructure. Just look at the Russian-Chinese deal, $500 billion, $600 billion worth of gas and infrastructure. I don't know whether they think that's sustainable. Usually they want to see solar cells and some old windmills and maybe some biogas, right? Some flatulence. But no, this is real hard commodity, heavy industrial development. And there's $50 billion now. There's also a $100 billion currency stabilization fund. Now, that is really understandable in the sense that these countries now are likely to face Anglo-American panic runs on their currencies. The rupee, the ruble, the renminbi, if possible. The Anglo-Americans, using credit default swaps, will attempt to attack the currencies of these countries. And therefore, it's good to have $100 billion. That helps to a significant degree in trying to defend your currency against the inevitable attacks coming from London and Wall Street. So $50 billion for investments, $100 billion for currency defense. This drives the Anglo-Americans nuts. And as if that weren't enough, we've also got these contributing things, right? The things that Obama actually talked about in his appearance, not today, Friday, but earlier this week on the 16th of July. He talked about the question of Iran, right? Will there be some conflict with Iran? But especially the question then of Syria, right? The Anglo-Americans are freaking out over the inauguration of Assad for a third term. Oh, my gosh. And all this ISIS, right? The ISIS seems to have disappeared from the front pages. Assad's got his new term in office. We congratulate him. We think that's the best solution available for the Syrian people by far. What are you going to do? It's a contest between Assad and chaos, or better yet, Assad and the Nusra Front, Assad and ISIS, Assad and Islamic Front, and all those people from the Free Syrian Army. They're all now relaxing in hotels across Western Europe and the Gulf. They don't exist anymore. There are no moderate rebels. There never were. And remember, the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist destabilization of Syria goes back decades, as was usefully pointed out by some media this week. There had been a multi-decade campaign to use Islamist terrorists against the neo-Nasserite government of Assad, and especially of the current Assad, Bashar. This has been going on for a long time. So don't say that those first demonstrations in February and March of 2011 were purely peaceful. They were not. There were films of people from the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, firing pictures, firing pistols. So all of that in the background, the inability to start a war in Syria, the coming of General Sisi and his nationalist forces, neo-Nasserist forces in Egypt. And don't tell me that Tony Blair changes the picture, right? You want to hire Tony Blair as an economic advisor, that can be pure deception. What, do you think you're going to really get economic advice from Tony Blair? Does he really know anything? You think Sisi is that dumb? I think that's a fig leaf. I think that's a deception posture. People, don't be so Pavlovian in your reactions. Wait for something to actually happen, or get on the internet and denounce Tony Blair, not Sisi. So all of this going on, right? Anglo-American elites absolutely freaked out, and then towards the beginning to middle of this week, it became clear that the Ukrainian army offensive, backed up by the fascists and terrorists of the right sector, Pravi sector, of Yarosh and company, and the late Muzichka, he's now a sort of Horst Wessel figure for these people, that this was failing. Not only failing, but that the Kiev fascist forces were being encircled, pocketed, the prelude to a battle of annihilation. In other words, the fascists had been pinned up against the Russian border by the so-called separatist rebels, right? And that is, we'll have a few things more to say about that. But that's the immediate prelude to Malaysian MH17. Back in a minute. Back to our another segment of World Crisis Radio. It's the 18th of July. So, when this week began, there were triumphalistic dispatches in all the Anglo-American NATO media that the days of the anti-fascist rebels, the anti-fascist forces in Ukraine, in the east, in Donetsk and Lugansk provinces, that their days were numbered. They were going to get wiped out. But this looks like Dr. Goebbels putting out stories that Stalingrad was about to fall in December of 1942, and instead it looks like the overextended Kiev fascist Soldateska have been encircled and pocketed by, on the one hand, the anti-fascist pro-Russian rebels, and then they've been pinned up against the Russian border. And you can look at my Twitter feed for this. Dramatic defeat of Kiev fascist forces enveloped between anti-Nazi troops and the Russian border. This comes from websites like Slavyangrad. Slavyangrad, I guess it's a play on Stalingrad. And in particular, the big defeats for the Kiev Soldateska include a place called Izvarnie and other points. And there's also one at this hill. Let's see. Anyway, it's you can see, if you go to my Twitter feed, you can see the actual bombardment of a hill occupied by the pro-Russian forces. But of course, it's not enough to get them out of there. It's the Saur Mogila, Saurmogila hill in East Ukraine. Artillery attacks, air attacks, but the pro-Russian forces still hang on. So there it is. The perspective, without some outside event, there was going to be a worldwide prise de conscience, a moment of awareness that these pro-fascists had been overextended and significant amounts of them had been pocketed. Now, the reason that Kiev would be interested in a ceasefire would be to allow those fascists to get out of the encirclements, right? The cauldrons, right? Kesselschlacht, Batalya Nalasaka, where they had been trapped in the mousetrap, as one of the pro-Russians says, and get out of there. So we'll have to see how that all works. So those, I think, are the important things. The overriding one is the BRICS Bank. This is the event of a century of world monetary history. You may remember there was an attempt to create an Asian development bank based on Japan and the yen during the time of the Asian contagion, about 1998 or thereabouts. And that Asian Monetary Fund would have been most welcome. That would have been an alternative regionally and soon beyond to the IMF and their bankrupt policies, the Washington Consensus, deregulation, privatization, destroy the social safety net, race to the bottom in wages, working conditions, and all the rest. But, of course, the Anglo-American clout was great enough in 1998 to prevent that Asian Monetary Fund from emerging. And now it's the BRICS Bank. We'll try to have some economists and technical experts on in the coming weeks to talk about this BRICS Bank, but you get the idea. It would be urgent to get the BRICS Bank going. I would suggest Egypt as an obvious place to start. You may also want to start with Syria. It's a bit harder to do these things under fire, but if you want to drain the bog and the swamp from which these Islamist characters have been drawing their sustenance. Nothing like successful economic development, full employment, jobs, rising standards of living, increased longevity, better public health, improved education, all the things that humanity really cares about. The real human rights that the U.S. stubbornly denies are human rights at all. The U.S. thinks it comes down to voting in a controlled election where CNN and a Washington pollster decide who won. Now, who did it? Of course, right? Now let's also set up the dangers. If we go back to 1914, we will see that World War I did not grow immediately out of the Sarajevo assassinations. In other words, from June 28, 1914, the assassinations, to July 28, 1914, the first declaration of war and mobilization day, that's one whole month. The immediate trigger was not the assassinations themselves, but it was an ultimatum by Austria-Hungary, by the Vienna government, to Serbia, demanding a series of measures designed to prevent terrorism, but also to investigate what had happened. And out of this, I think the ultimatum had 10 or 11 points. Serbia accepted all the points, I think about 10, all but one. And the one point that Serbia rejected was the idea that Austro-Hungarian officials sent from Vienna would come on to the territory of Serbia in Belgrade, and they would go where they wanted and do what they wanted and probe and sift and demand documents and so forth and compel testimony on Serbian territory among Serbian citizens, right? The big question of national sovereignty obviously coming up. It would have been possible to finesse that point. The Serbs said no on that point, understandable. Would have been possible, given the positive answer on 10 points, to avoid war. The person who made sure that war occurred that this did not stop the drive to war was the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, Count Berchtold, Berchtold, who essentially simply disregarded the positive answer on 10 points and focused only on the negative answer, and then declared war on Serbia. That was, I believe, the 28th of July. Now, as soon as we're talking about an investigation of this plane, who's going to do that investigation? We had people today on National Public Radio, Diane Rehm, saying, it's got to be an investigation that the entire world looks at as credible. And, of course, the most credible are the expert firms in London and in Washington. Well, that is not going to work. And you can see how far from reality these characters are. We can say that 13 years after 9/11, some of us who have labored in that vineyard can say that the gullibility, the willingness of world public opinion to be duped by these false flag or provocation operations, this has declined notably, but still, the Anglo-Americans are still pushing their thing, right? What we say is the truth, and if you disagree, you're a paranoid, of course, a paranoid. Take a look at my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, in the 5th edition, and you'll be ready for all of these. So if there's going to be a probe, who's going to do it? National Transportation Safety Board? They have no jurisdiction. Is it going to be the Malaysian authorities? I have to say a word about Malaysians. Let's not, they're being targeted too. This is the country of Mahathir Mohamad, right? The country that did impose capital controls and exchange controls in 1998 and came out of that crisis faster and better than anybody else involved. However, we have to say, if Malaysian 370 in March did not cause a world war, was not worth a world war, then why should Malaysian 17 cause a world war? It's not worth a world war, and this investigation is not worth a world war. The other way you can look at it is we got about 250 Palestinians killed in the past week. No, that doesn't seem to matter at all. But, these people killed on this plane, that's worth World War III. Sorry, not worth World War III. Hashtag no new July 1914. No new July 1914. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. on the afternoon of Friday, the 18th of July. Now, we've looked at the BRICS Bank, and again, I repeat, the casus belli is the BRICS Bank, the attempt to breach the Anglo-American monopoly of International Monetary Fund, World Bank lending, to give people an alternative where destabilization and meddling in the internal affairs of sovereign states will not be the order of the day. And again, forget about sustainable. There are words like sustainable and stewardship that come loaded with Malthusian overtones, right? The sediment, as Derrida would have said, but the not so much the denotation, but the connotation. The connotation is Malthusian, right? That it's going to be windmills. Appropriate technology is what they used to call it. Appropriate means if you're from the third world, you're backward. You get backward, old, useless, non-competitive technology. No, this is going to be the real thing. Again, I recommend Egypt. I recommend the Second Nile. I recommend starting the Cape to Cairo Railway or Cairo to Cape Railway across Africa. The Chinese would be delighted. And I recommend the Dakar to Djibouti. And once they cross in the middle, then fix that connection between the Nile and the Congo, make that into a navigable inland waterway system, and you will go far towards opening up Africa to actual modern development. And don't overthrow governments in the process. Rather, work with these governments. Now, we've got the U.S. sanctions that had been imposed during the week. This points up the difficulty that the Malaysian airliner is supposed to solve. On Wednesday, the day before the Malaysian airliner, we have a new round of sanctions. Now, this includes Gazprom Bank. So they don't attack Gazprom, which is the company, the Russian company that ships gas to Western Europe through the Nord Stream pipeline down the bottom of the Baltic. That won't be interfered with. There's a pipeline across Belarus. That won't be interfered with. But all the ones across Ukraine will be sabotaged. This is why Putin built Gazprom, built the Nord Stream with the help of Gerhard Schröder of Germany. And Putin was so little interested in blackmailing Ukraine that he built the South Stream, was trying to build the South Stream pipeline with the help of Turkey and Berlusconi. One of the reasons that Berlusconi had to be attacked, and I have to now, parenthetically, as a sidebar, Berlusconi found innocent of the principal thing that was used to drive him out of office. And the reason Berlusconi was driven out of office was not anything about corruption or women or anything of the sort, but that he was a close ally of Putin. He was becoming the lawyer, the advocate for Putin in the councils of the European Union. That's why, people, don't be manipulated, right? Don't be a dupe, because being a dupe in this climate is dangerous for your health. So, Gazprom Bank sanctioned, not Gazprom per se, but the bank that they work with. Rosneft oil company has been targeted by these sanctions, and the one that I would point, they would also, before we get to the banks now, the second largest gas producer, Novatek, on the Russian side, sanctioned. But the one that I'm interested in most is Vnesh Ekonombank, VEB. VEB is essentially the payments agent for the Russian government. It's a little bit like Bank of New York Mellon was the back office for the TARP, right? The bailout of 2008. VEB does a whole series of operations for the Russian government, and VEB figures prominently in the plans elaborated by Sergei Glaziev, our favorite among the advisors of Putin. So There's also Feodosia Enterprises, a shipping company in the Crimea, and senior Russian officials, some of whom already targeted by the European side. The deputy head of the State Duma, a minister of the Crimean regional government, a commander of the Russian intelligence agency FSB, and a Ukrainian separatist leader. We'll try to get the details on this, right? The Treasury supposedly has a list, but they've got it well hidden. So that is the lowdown on these sanctions. Again, the reason why you want to get an airliner with 150 citizens of the Netherlands on board is that this is obviously to stimulate Western Europe to goad them into joining the sanctions, because the European response to these U.S. sanctions second round was tepid at best. Now, given these sanctions, it's time to implement the Glaziev plan, right? The full Glaziev. We want the full Glaziev. And that means, first of all, exchange controls and capital controls. No more hot money. You got to get government permission to send money in or out. That's essential, even with a $100 billion currency fund, which still has to be created and launched. You got to protect your ruble against the Anglo-American attacks, using, above all, credit default swaps. You probably ought to ban credit default swaps in Russia pretty much immediately. Capital controls, exchange controls. The next question is, if the U.S. is attacking you, we have Putin saying the sanctions are evil, and they may take relations between Russia and the West back to the 1980s. Well, let's go back to the 1980s. You want to have, vis-a-vis the U.S., you probably want to have a state monopoly on international trade. Yes, you probably do. But above all, you want to have the threat of defaulting on all money owed to New York and London banks. You want to threaten that, and you want to threaten, as Glaziev has said all these things, Glaziev, among his points, also has the idea of dumping the entire portfolio of U.S. Treasury securities, which the Russian Federation currently holds. That is, according to some estimates, $200 billion, $300 billion. Could be a little bit more. I would actually guess something like $500 billion, but it's difficult to determine. Some of that in government hands in Russia, some of it in private or state-owned company hands. And then, of course, the big one, the central bank, Nabiullina, has to be either brought on board or replaced. Nabiullina has not been going along with the program, but the idea would be the Russian central bank would abandon its current policy of being a satellite of the U.S. Federal Reserve. The Russian central bank, as Glaziev has pointed out, only creates new rubles when they have dollars in the vault. And that is essentially the dollar reserve standard, right? That's the reserve standard of Bretton Woods post August 15th, 1971. And then you got to get out of that. You've got to start issuing your own ruble-denominated loans at very, very low interest rates, as close to zero as you can get, and that has to go for infrastructure, foreign trade, financing. It has to go for manufacturing, agriculture, mining, forestry, scientific research, and so forth. So there we go with the full Glaziev. And that's what I think may now have a possibility of being realized. The point is, we've had the sanctions now. We've had one round of sanctions, and we've now had a second round of sanctions. There's even pressure to get the Europeans into the sanctions. And hopefully, the fact that the U.S. is behaving in this way should strengthen the hand of the Glaziev-Putin faction as against Medvedev, Kudrin, Greff, and these pro-Western, pro-IMF liberals. That's what we have to hope for inside Russia. Back in a minute.